What if I told you that the entire Walking Dead saga, every community built, every war fought, every life saved, and every life lost, all of it balances on a handful of quiet moments where one person made one choice? And if any of those choices had gone differently, the world that followed would be unrecognizable. Tonight we're going to explore those moments. 10 alternate timelines, each one rooted in something that actually happened in the show, and then we're going to follow the thread and see where it leads. These aren't random guesses. Every scenario starts with a verified event from the series, a real turning point, and then asks the simplest question imaginable. What if? So settle in, get comfortable. You don't need to watch this, you just need to listen. Let these stories wash over you. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle, that's perfectly fine. These timelines will still be here. The roads not taken don't go anywhere, they just wait. Let's start with the one that changes everything. The very first domino. What if Rick Grimes never woke up from his coma? Picture the King County Hospital in rural Georgia. It's the early days of the outbreak, maybe a few weeks in, and the world is falling apart faster than anyone can process. Military personnel are sweeping the hallways, executing the infected, evacuating whoever they can. Nurses are screaming. Gunfire echoes through corridors that used to smell like antiseptic and floor wax. And in one small room, on one small bed, a man lies perfectly still. Rick Grimes, sheriff's deputy. He shot in the line of duty during a high-speed pursuit when a third gunman crawled out of an overturned vehicle and put a bullet through his side, just below the vest. His partner and best friend, Shane Walsh, had been there when it happened. Shane had killed the shooter. Shane had ridden in the ambulance, and now Shane was standing in this room, while the world ended around him, trying to decide what to do about the man who wouldn't wake up. In the version of events we know, Shane put his ear to Rick's chest, heard nothing over the chaos, and made the agonizing decision to leave. He barricaded the door with a hospital gurney, a small act of hope disguised as a farewell, and he ran. Weeks later, Rick opened his eyes to an empty room. Dead flowers on the nightstand, machines silent, the hallway dark and streaked with blood. He pulled himself out of bed, stumbled through a hospital full of the dead, and walked out into a Georgia afternoon that would change the course of history. But what if he didn't? What if the fever that often follows a gunshot wound, the infection, the dehydration, all of it was simply too much for a body lying alone in a powerless hospital, with no IV drip and no one to change his bandages? What if Rick Grimes, the man who had become the most important leader the survivors ever knew, simply slipped away in his sleep sometime in those first terrible weeks? No walkers got to him. The barricade held. He just never opened his eyes. The first thing that changes is Shane. In our timeline, Shane carried guilt like a stone in his chest. He told Laurie that Rick was dead because he believed it. He listened for a heartbeat and heard silence. Why, he made the call. And then he fell in love with his best friend's wife, became a father figure to his best friend's son, and built a version of a life that felt borrowed from the start. When Rick showed up alive at the quarry camp outside Atlanta, Shane's entire identity cracked down the middle. Everything that followed, the jealousy, the paranoia, the slow descent into something dangerous, all of it grew from that crack. But in this timeline, there is no crack. Rick never comes back. Shane's relationship with Laurie solidifies without the guilt, without the ghost of a man who should be dead but isn't. Carl grows up calling Shane something close to Dad. Not officially, maybe not ever out loud, but in practice. In the quiet moments when Shane teaches him to tie knots, or check a perimeter, or sleep with one eye open, Shane leads the quarry group with the same aggressive confidence he always had. But without Rick's moral compass to push against, that confidence hardens into something less flexible. Shane was always a survivalist first. He made decisions based on threat assessment, not hope. When the group debates whether to head for the CDC or Fort Benning, there's no Rick to insist on the CDC. Shane drives them south. Fort Benning is overrun, because of course it is, and the group loses people in the attempt. Maybe Jim, maybe others. They never meet Dr. Edwin Jenner. They never learn that everyone is already infected, that the virus is in their blood regardless of whether they've been bitten. That knowledge, the secret Jenner whispered in Rick's ear. The truth that reanimation happens to everyone upon death never reaches this group. And that changes things in ways both small and enormous. Every time someone dies of natural causes or an injury, the group is caught off guard by the reanimation. People die from that surprise, people who didn't have to. Without Rick's instinct for seeking shelter and building something permanent, the group stays nomadic longer. Shane's philosophy is to keep moving. Walls make you complacent. Staying in one place makes you a target. He'd have said something like that, and in the short term, he'd be right. But in the long term, nomadic groups bleed members. Exhaustion, illness, exposure, the random cruelty of a world where a twisted ankle can be a death sentence. The group never reaches Herschel Green's farm, or if they do, the encounter plays out very differently. Without Rick, there's no one to negotiate with Herschel. He had no one patient enough to earn the old veterinarian's trust. Shane would have demanded shelter, or taken it. Herschel would have pointed his shotgun at them and told them to leave, and Shane, God help him, might have shot first. So let's say Herschel's farm remains untouched by our group. The Greens live in quiet isolation for a while longer, feeding walkers in the barn, because Herschel still believes they're sick people. Eventually, a herd overruns them. Without Rick's people to help fight, without Glenn to fall in love with Maggie and give her a reason to see the world as it really is, the Green family likely dies on that farm. Herschel, Maggie, Beth, all of them. Which means Maggie never becomes the leader she was born to be. She never takes over the hilltop. She never stands toe to toe with the saviors. She never looks Negan in the eye and refuses to break. And that brings us to the prison. In our timeline, Rick's group discovered the West Georgia Correctional Facility and saw what Shane never would have seen. Not just walls, but a home. A place to plant crops, to raise children, to build something that felt like civilization again. Rick fought for that prison. He cleared it cell block by cell block, lost his wife Laurie in childbirth within its walls, buried friends in its yard, and defended it until the governor tore it down. Without Rick, the prison sits empty, or someone else claims it, someone without Rick's vision for what it could become. The governor, Philip Blake, still rises in Woodbury. He still builds his arena and his army and his fragile kingdom of lies. But without the prison group to obsess over, his madness takes a different shape. Maybe he turns it inward, and Woodbury eats itself. Maybe he expands outward, and smaller groups of survivors pay the price. Either way, the counterweight is gone. No Rick, no Herschel, no Daryl, no Glenn, no Michonne with her katana and her quiet fury. None of the people who eventually stopped the governor are in position to do so. Let's follow the timeline further. Years pass. The world continues to rot and rebuild in cycles. Negan still emerges. A man like that doesn't need Rick Grimes to exist in order to find power. He would have found the sanctuary, recruited his saviors, built his system of tribute and fear. Lucille still swings. The only difference is that the communities Negan subjugates are smaller, weaker, and less organized. There's no Alexandria. It's because Deanna Monroe's safe zone never receives the hardened survivors who could protect it. There's no hilltop under Maggie's leadership. There's no kingdom with Ezekiel's theatrical courage. Negan rules unchallenged. The saviors become the dominant force in the southeastern United States, and there is no alliance strong enough to oppose them. And further still, the Civic Republic Military, the CRM, the organization that would eventually take Rick and hold him for more than 6 years, still exists. They still operate in the shadows. They still destroyed Omaha and its campus colony. They still plan to eliminate Portland. But without Rick, there's no one inside their ranks who carries the fire needed to expose them, no one who slashes through their secrecy and forces reform. The CRM continues unchecked. Toast, their vision of survival through control and elimination, spreads across the continent. Daryl Dixon still exists in this timeline, somewhere, Without Rick, Daryl never becomes the man we know. He stays closer to who he was at the quarry, Merle's little brother, rough and suspicious and capable of violence, but not yet capable of love. The people who softened him, who showed him that loyalty could be something more than blood obligation, most of them are dead or scattered. Carol might still find him, because Carol has a way of finding the people she needs. But without the family that Rick built, what Daryl and Carol have is smaller. A partnership of survivors, not a family of believers. And over in France, decades later, there is no Daryl washing ashore. No one to protect a boy named Laurent. No one to carry the strange hope of a group of nuns who believe the world can be reborn. The union of hope waits for a messenger who never comes. This is what the absence of one man looks like. Not an explosion, not a single catastrophic event, but a slow, spreading silence. 1,000 small moments that never happen because the person who would have made them happen is lying still in a hospital bed in King County, Georgia. The machine stopped a long time ago, the hallway outside is dark, and a world that desperately needed Rick Grimes never knew what it lost. But that's just one road not taken. And tonight, we have 9 more to explore. Let's move to a different field, on a different night, where moonlight falls on 2 men who used to be brothers. What if Shane Walsh killed Rick Grimes in that moonlit field on Herschel's farm? You remember the setup? Shane had been unravelling for weeks. He'd killed Otis at the high school to save himself and brought back the surgical supplies with a story no one fully believed. He'd opened the barn full of walkers and emptied his gun into the dead while Herschel's family screamed. And through all of it, the one thing eating him alive wasn't guilt, it was Rick. Rick, who came back from the dead. Rick, who reclaimed his wife and son. Rick, who led with patience and mercy in a world that Shane believed demanded neither. So Shane hatched a plan. He took their prisoner, a young man named Randall, into the woods and broke his neck. Then he slammed his own face into a tree to fake an injury and came back to camp shouting that Randall had escaped and was armed. It worked. Rick agreed to search the dark forest with him. And, in a clearing under the stars, Shane pulled his gun and prepared to do what he'd been building toward since the day Rick Grimes walked back into his life. In the version we know, Rick saw it coming. He talked Shane close, told him it didn't have to be this way, and when Shane lowered his guard for just a moment, Rick slid a knife into his chest. Shane died in Rick's arms, and Rick wept over the body of the man who was once his brother. Then Carl appeared, gun raised, and shot the reanimated Shane through the head. But what if Rick didn't see the betrayal coming? What if Shane was faster, or colder, or simply luckier? The gun goes off. Rick falls in the field, and the world changes. Carl is there. He heard the shot. He comes running through the dark and finds his father on the ground. Shane standing over him with a story already forming on his lips. Walkers did it. Came out of nowhere. I tried to save him. Carl is 12 years old and smarter than anyone gives him credit for. But he's also terrified and alone in the dark. And the only adult left is the man holding the gun. So Carl says nothing. He lets Shane lead him back to the farmhouse. And whatever suspicion lives in his chest, it stays there, quiet and growing. Laurie knows. Not immediately, maybe not consciously, but she knows. Women who've been intimate with both sides of a lie can feel the shape of it, even when they can't name it. She looks at Shane's face when he tells the story, and something in his eyes doesn't match the words, but what can she do? She's pregnant. She's alone. The world is ending, and the man in front of her, however damaged, however dangerous, is the only thing standing between her children and the dark. Shane becomes the unchallenged leader of the group, and in fairness, he's effective. He makes the hard calls faster than Rick ever did. When the herd overruns Herschel's farm, Shane's the one barking orders, shooting from the hip, getting people to the vehicles. The group loses Jimmy and Patricia, same as in our timeline, but they survive the night. They hit the road. The difference becomes clear in the weeks and months that follow. Shane doesn't look for a place to build. He looks for a place to hide. The prison, if they find it at all, becomes a fortress under his command. Not a home, not a community, a bunker. Shane would have killed every prisoner inside on the first day. No debate, no moral wrestling, no keeping Axel and Oscar alive because they might be decent men. They're threats. Threats get eliminated. And Herschel, the man who became Rick's conscience and closest advisor, never gets that role under Shane. Herschel would have pushed back, and Shane would have pushed harder. The old veterinarian becomes a medic at best, a liability at worst. The quiet wisdom that carried the group through its darkest hours, the belief that you don't have to lose your soul to keep your life, gets silenced. Daryl's role shifts. In our timeline, Daryl's loyalty to Rick transformed him from Merle Dixon's feral little brother into the most dependable man in the apocalypse. Rick saw something in Daryl that no one else bothered to look for. Under Shane's leadership, Daryl is valued for his tracking and his violence, but never for his heart. He becomes an enforcer, not a brother. Carol still reaches him, because Carol has always been able to reach Daryl, but the version of him that emerges is harder, angrier, less willing to believe that people can be better than their worst impulses. The governor still comes, Woodbury still rises, and when Philip Blake turns his attention toward the prison, the war that follows is uglier and shorter than the one in our timeline. Shane meets the governor, not with Rick's reluctant diplomacy, but with immediate, escalating violence. Two men who believe that the only answer is force, crashing into each other like trains on the same track. The prison falls faster, more people die. Herschel might be among them, without the respect and protection Rick afforded him. And Carl is the real tragedy of this timeline. Under Rick's guidance, Carl struggled with the darkness inside him, but he was always pulled back by his father's example. Rick showed Carl that strength and mercy weren't opposites, that you could be hard enough to survive and soft enough to be worth surviving for. Under Shane, Carl learns a different lesson. Strength is all that matters. Trust is weakness. Kill before you're killed. The boy who, in our timeline, grew up to write letters about peace and forgiveness. The boy who sacrificed himself helping a stranger because he believed that's what his father would want him to do. That boy never exists in Shane's world. Instead, Carl becomes Shane's heir. A young man forged in suspicion and violence, as dangerous as anyone in the wasteland, and half as human. So when the saviors come, and they would come, because Negan always comes, the group they find isn't a community, it's a militia. And the war between Shane's people and Negan's people isn't a story about hope versus tyranny. It's a story about two tyrants fighting over territory. There's no Carl to write a letter that changes his father's heart. There's no Judith growing up in a house with a porch and a garden. There's just the sound of a bat meeting flesh, and the silence that follows. Maybe that's the lesson of this timeline. Not that Shane was a villain. He wasn't, not entirely. He was a man who loved fiercely and feared deeply and never learned the difference between protecting people and controlling them. In a world without Rick, Shane builds something that works, for a while, but it doesn't last because the things that last need more than force. They need the thing that Rick carried in his chest like a lantern in the dark. They need hope. And in this timeline, hope bled out in a moonlit field on a Georgia farm, and no one even said goodbye. Let's move to something gentler now. A story about a little girl and a barn door, and the moment everything could have been different. What if Sophia Pelletier was found alive? This might be the quietest turning point in the entire Walking Dead saga, but its ripple effects are enormous. Sophia, 12 years old, daughter of Ed and Carol Pelletier, went missing in the second season when a herd of walkers appeared on the highway where the group had stopped. Rick chased 2 walkers away from her and hid Sophia near a creek bed, telling her to stay put while he drew the dead away. When he came back, she was gone. The search for Sophia consumed the first half of season 2. Daryl nearly killed himself looking for her, falling from a ridge and getting impaled by one of his own crossbow bolts. Carol prayed in an empty church, The entire group poured its energy into finding one small girl because finding her meant something. It meant that in this broken world, you could still save the people who needed saving. And then the barn opened. Herschel had been keeping walkers in his barn, feeding them chickens because he believed they were still people, sick people, his wife, his neighbours, members of his congregation. Shane lost patience and broke the locks. The group lined up and gunned down every walker that stumbled into the daylight. And when the last one emerged, small and grey, and wearing a rainbow shirt, Carol screamed. Sophia had been in the barn the whole time, bitten, turned, and locked away by Herschel's people, who found her wandering the swamp. The search had been for nothing. Rick stepped forward, raised his revolver, and put her down. But what if Daryl had found her 2 days earlier? What if his tracking, his stubbornness, his refusal to stop looking had paid off before Sophia was bitten? Picture him carrying her out of the woods, dirty and shaking and alive. Carol running to them. The group exhaling. Everything changes, starting with Carol. In our timeline, Sophia's death was the crucible that forged Carol Pelletier into one of the most dangerous and capable survivors in the Walking Dead universe. The soft, abused woman who flinched at loud noises became someone who could kill without hesitation, who burned sick people alive to stop a plague, who walked into an enemy compound alone and slaughtered her way out. Carol's transformation was built on grief, on the understanding that softness gets your daughter killed. But if Sophia lives, that transformation never happens, or it happens differently, more slowly, shaped by the need to protect rather than the need to avenge. Carol remains gentler. She still grows stronger. The apocalypse demands it. But the cold steel at her center, the willingness to do anything without flinching, that comes later, if at all. And that matters enormously, because Carol's ruthlessness saved the group on multiple occasions. The most critical was at Terminus, when Rick, Daryl, Glenn, Bob, and others were captured by the cannibals and lined up over a slaughter trough. It was Carol who attacked the compound solo. She used a propane tank and a bottle rocket to trigger an explosion, then drove a herd of walkers through the breach. Without that assault, the group dies at Terminus. Glenn dies not by Negan's bat, but by a butcher's knife. So here's the butterfly effect. If Sophia lives, Carol is softer. If Carol is softer, Terminus might be the end of the line, unless someone else fills that role. Unless Sophia herself, having grown up hard in this world, becomes the fighter her mother might not be. Imagine a teenage Sophia at the prison. She'd be Carl's age, roughly. They would have grown up side by side, two children of the apocalypse, learning to shoot and run and hide. Sophia saw her father beat her mother. She spent days alone in the Georgia woods, terrified, surviving on instinct. That girl doesn't grow up soft. And even with her mother alive and loving, she grows up knowing exactly how fragile everything is. At Terminus, maybe it's Sophia who acts. Maybe it's a girl who learned from Daryl how to track, and from Carol how to endure, and from the woods themselves how to be silent and deadly. Maybe the person who saves the group from the slaughter trough isn't a hardened woman with a rifle, but a teenage girl with a crossbow bolt, and the memory of what it felt like to be hunted. And further along the timeline, Sophia's presence changes the group's emotional landscape. Carol never kills Karen and David at the prison, the act that got her banished by Rick and sent her wandering alone. Without that banishment, Carol is inside the prison when the governor attacks. She's there for the fall. She's there for the road to Terminus. Daryl's arc changes too. Finding Sophia would have been the first time in his life that Daryl succeeded at something purely good. Not surviving, not fighting, but saving. That validation would have accelerated his transformation from a loner into someone who believes he's worth something. His bond with Carol deepens around a shared victory instead of a shared loss. And Sophia herself becomes a character we never got to know. A young woman of the apocalypse, raised by a community that fought for her, carrying the knowledge that people once tore the world apart, looking for one little girl because she mattered. That knowledge, that sense of being worth saving, would shape everything she did. There are smaller ripples too. Herschel's barn revelation is less devastating without Sophia inside it. The group and the Greens still clash over the walkers, but the moral injury is shallower. The alliance forms faster. Glenn and Maggie's relationship develops without the shadow of a dead child. The prison era with Sophia present means Carol stays. Carol staying means no exile, no wandering, no stumbling into Terminus alone and becoming its destroyer from the outside. Someone else has to fill that role, or the group has to find another way out. And in the quiet moments, late at night, in whatever shelter the group has found, Sophia sits with Carl and they talk about things kids talk about. Stupid things, important things. They're the only two their age in the entire world, as far as they know. And there's something beautiful about that. Two children finding each other in the ruins and reminding each other what it means to be young. And sometimes the biggest changes don't come from battles or betrayals. Sometimes they come from a man in a leather vest with a crossbow, walking through the woods, calling a little girl's name, and hearing her answer. Let's stay in this gentler space for a moment. Let's talk about a man with a white beard and a missing leg and more courage than anyone gave him credit for. What if Herschel Green survived the governor's attack on the prison? You can probably still see it. The governor standing on top of a tank outside the prison fences, Michonne's katana in his hand, Herschel kneeling before him with his hands bound. Rick standing on the other side of the fence, pleading, trying to find the words that would stop what was about to happen, and for a moment, it almost worked. Rick gave one of the best speeches of his life that day. He talked about change, about how everyone who'd made it this far had done terrible things to survive, but they could still come back. They weren't too far gone. Herschel smiled when he heard it, because Herschel had been saying something like that for years, and hearing it come from Rick's mouth meant that the lesson had finally landed. Then the governor muttered the word, liar, and swung the blade. Herschel was partially decapitated by the first strike. The governor hacked at his neck until the job was done, while Beth and Maggie screamed from inside the prison. The war that followed destroyed the prison, scattered the group, and sent every survivor running into the wilderness alone, or in pairs, broken and bleeding and grieving. But what if the governor hesitated? What if Rick's words reached not Herschel, but the people standing behind the governor, the reluctant soldiers from Woodbury who didn't sign up for executions? What if someone like Tara Chambler, who was standing right there, visibly horrified, had stepped forward and said stop? What if that moment of hesitation gave Michonne enough time to roll free of her bindings and intervene? Herschel survives, wounded, badly, but alive, and the ripple effects are staggering. The prison still falls, the governor's tank still crashes through the fences, and the war still forces the group to scatter. But this time, someone carries Herschel out. Maybe it's Maggie and Glenn. Maybe it's Rick himself, bleeding from his own wounds, dragging the old man to a vehicle. Herschel has already lost one leg to a walker bite that Rick amputated with a hatchet in the prison cafeteria months earlier. He moves on crutches or a makeshift prosthetic. He's slow, he's fragile, and he's the most important person in the group. Because Herschel was the moral centre. He was the one who told Rick that you don't have to give up who you are to survive. He was the one who nursed the sick during the flu outbreak at the prison, walking among the dying with nothing but his medical bag and his faith. He was the veterinarian who became the group's only doctor, who saved Carl's life after the boy was accidentally shot by Otis, who delivered Judith when Laurie died in childbirth. Every time Rick drifted toward darkness, Herschel was there to pull him back. With Herschel alive, the road from the prison to Terminus is different. The group's morale is higher, not by much, but enough. Herschel's presence reminds them that they're not just running, they're moving towards something. At Alexandria, Herschel becomes the bridge between Rick's hardened survivors and Deanna Monroe's sheltered community. Where Rick's group intimidated the Alexandrians with their scars and their 1,000-yard stares, Herschel would have charmed them. He had that gift, the ability to make people feel safe and heard while quietly steering them toward difficult truths. Deanna would have trusted Herschel immediately, and through Herschel, she would have trusted Rick. The most fascinating question is what happens when Negan arrives. In our timeline, Glenn's death at Negan's hands was made more devastating by Herschel's absence. Maggie had already lost her father. Now she was losing her husband. The grief compounded. But if Herschel is alive, if Herschel is kneeling in that lineup alongside everyone else, the dynamics of that terrible night shift. Negan respected strength. He was drawn to people who didn't break. Imagine Herschel, one-legged, white-bearded, looking up at Negan with the same calm he showed the governor. Not defiant exactly, just unafraid. Negan would have noticed that. Whether it would have changed his choice is impossible to know. The bat might still fall on Abraham. It might still fall on Glenn. But Herschel's presence in the aftermath, his ability to hold the group together through grief, would have changed how they responded. And here's the detail that haunts me most: Carl's death. In our timeline, Carl was bitten by a walker while helping a stranger named Siddiq in the woods. He was fulfilling what he believed was a moral duty, honouring the dead by killing walkers, something Siddiq's mother had taught him. Carl did it because he was Rick's son, because Herschel had taught him through years of example that mercy and compassion weren't weaknesses. With Herschel alive, does Carl still take that risk? Probably. The instinct toward kindness was deep in Carl by that point. But Herschel might have been there. Herschel might have found a way to help Siddiq that didn't involve two teenagers fighting walkers in an open forest. Herschel might have said something like, "Let me handle this," in that gentle, firm way of his. And Carl might have listened, because Carl always listened to Herschel. If Carl lives because Herschel is there, then everything changes again. Rick never loses his son. The letters Carl wrote about mercy and peace are never written, because they don't need to be. Carl is alive to speak those words himself. And Rick's decision to spare Negan isn't driven by a dead boy's final wish. It's driven by a living boy standing next to him, asking him to be the man he always promised he could be. Some people change the world by fighting. Herschel changed it by healing, by listening, by believing in the possibility of redemption when everyone around him had given up on it. In this timeline, that belief doesn't die at the prison gates. It lives on, steady and stubborn and white-bearded, walking on one good leg through a world that needs it desperately. Now let's go somewhere darker, to a room with a trough and a drain, and the sound of a blade being sharpened. What if Carol didn't save the group at Terminus? Of all the what-ifs in the Walking Dead saga, this one is the most immediately lethal. Because at Terminus, the group wasn't facing a philosophical threat or a slow-building danger. They were minutes from being butchered. Here's what happened. After the prison fell and the group scattered, they followed signs painted on railroad tracks that read, "Sanctuary for all, community for all. Those who arrive, survive." Those signs led to Terminus, a former railroad hub that had been converted into what appeared to be a welcoming community. When Rick, Carl, Daryl and Michonne arrived, they were cautious enough to bury a bag of weapons outside the fence before entering. Smart move. Inside, they quickly realized something was wrong. Rick spotted Herschel's pocket watch on one of the Terminus residents. He saw Glenn's riot gear. He saw the poncho Maggie had been wearing. These people had been taking things from other survivors, things they shouldn't have had. Rick grabbed the nearest Terminus resident and demanded answers, which triggered a firefight that ended with Rick's group being herded into a train car. Inside, they found Glenn, Maggie, Abraham, Rosita, Eugene, Sasha, Bob, and Tara, all captured. And then came the trough. The next morning, Rick, Daryl, Glenn, and Bob were lined up over a metal trough alongside 4 strangers. Terminus operatives stood behind them with baseball bats and knives. They were killing people in batches, stunning them with a bat, slitting their throats, letting the blood drain. Assembly line butchery. Glenn was positioned over the drain. The knife was raised, and then an explosion rocked the compound. Carol had been travelling separately, having been banished by Rick earlier for killing Karen and David at the prison. She and Tyrese had found a Terminus operative named Martin, who was monitoring an outpost. From him, she learned that her friends were being held inside. Carol assessed the situation, found a propane tank near the compound's fence, shot it with a rifle to create an explosion, and used the breach in a stampeding herd of walkers to assault Terminus solo. It worked. The explosion disrupted the slaughter. Rick freed himself, killed his captors, and armed the group. They fought their way out. Everyone survived. Carol became the hero. But what if she wasn't there? Maybe Carol never encountered Martin at the outpost. Maybe she and Tyrese took a different road. Maybe she was a day behind the group instead of parallel to them. Or whatever the reason, no explosion comes. No walkers breach the fence. The men with the bats and knives continue their work uninterrupted. Glenn dies first. The bat comes down. The knife follows. And the man who carried the group's conscience, who loved Maggie with everything he had, who once crawled under a dumpster to survive because the world needed him alive, dies in a slaughterhouse drain with strangers on either side of him. Bob is next, then the strangers, then the men come for Rick. But Rick isn't like the others. Rick is a survivor in a way that transcends normal human capability. Even bound, even positioned over a trough, Rick Grimes is calculating. Maybe he breaks free. Maybe the weapons he buried outside give him a slim chance, but it's slim, very slim. And without the chaos of an external assault to distract the Terminus operatives, the odds are overwhelmingly bad. Let's say Rick dies here, Daryl too. Carl, still locked in the train car, never gets out. Michonne, Abraham, Rosita, Eugene, Maggie, Sasha, Tara, all of them starve or are slaughtered in batches over the following days. Terminus continues to operate, luring survivors with its painted signs, feeding on the desperate and the hopeful. The world without Rick's group is a world without a counterweight to every threat that follows. Negan rises unopposed. The CRM operates without interference. Alexandria, Hilltop, the Kingdom, all of these communities exist in some form, but without the hardened survivors who made them strong enough to resist, they fold. One by one, they break. And all of it traces back to one woman with a rifle and a propane tank who showed up at exactly the right moment and did the impossible alone. Carol Pelletier, the woman whose daughter came out of a barn as a walker, the woman who burned the sick to save the healthy, the woman who was banished for doing what she believed was necessary. She walked up to the walls of a cannibal compound and tore them down because her family was inside. And nobody, not the living and not the dead, was going to stop her. Without that, everyone dies. That's the weight of one person. That's the thread the whole tapestry hangs on. A woman nobody believed in, doing the thing nobody thought was possible, on a Tuesday morning in Georgia while the world chewed itself apart. So if you ever wonder whether one person can change everything, think about Terminus. Think about the drain and the knife and the seconds ticking down. And think about Carol walking through fire, because love is a better weapon than fear ever was. Let's rest here for a moment. Let the weight of that settle. And when you're ready, we'll move on to a night that no one in this world can ever forget. A clearing in the woods, a man with a bat, and the choice that could have changed everything. What if Negan killed Daryl instead of Glenn? The clearing in the woods, the RV, the kneeling. You know this scene, and if you're a fan of this show, you probably can't forget it no matter how hard you try. Rick and his people on their knees in a semicircle, Negan pacing in front of them with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, playing a children's counting game to decide who dies. Negan chose Abraham first. That was the game's result. Abraham Ford, the big red-headed soldier who'd survived a war before the world ended and another one after it did. Negan's bat came down and Abraham sat back up, blood streaming down his face, and said his final words with the same defiant absurdity that defined his character. Then the bat came down again and again until Abraham was gone. That should have been the end of it. One death to establish the rules of a new world order. One life to buy compliance from the rest. Negan said as much. The first one is free, but Daryl couldn't accept it. In a moment of pure, unfiltered rage, Daryl launched himself from his kneeling position and punched Negan in the face. Dwight and 2 other saviors wrestled him to the ground, and Dwight aimed Daryl's own crossbow at his head. Negan stopped him, not out of mercy, but because he saw something useful in Daryl, something he could break. Instead, Negan punished the group for Daryl's defiance by killing Glenn. He said it plainly. There are no exceptions. Actions have consequences, and the consequence of Daryl's fist meeting Negan's jaw was Lucille meeting Glenn's skull. Glenn sat up after the first 2 blows, his skull dented, one eye dislodged, and with his last breath he looked at Maggie and stammered, "Maggie, I'll find you." Then Negan finished it. And the man who'd been with this group since he rescued Rick from a tank in downtown Atlanta, the man who ran toward danger because it was the right thing to do, the man who loved Maggie Green with everything he had, was gone. But what if Negan's punishment fell on Daryl himself? What if, instead of looking at the group and choosing Glenn as the object lesson, Negan turned the bat on the man who threw the punch? You want to act out? You pay the price, not your friends. You. Daryl Dixon, crossbow hunter, tracker, brother, the beating heart of the group in a way that Rick was the mind, and Glenn was the conscience. Lucille comes down on him instead. The immediate aftermath is a nuclear winter of grief that hits differently than Glenn's death did. Carol, who had already left Alexandria because the weight of killing was destroying her, would be annihilated by this news. Daryl was her person. Not in a romantic sense, though the show danced around that for years. In a deeper sense, Daryl was the one who searched for Sophia when everyone else was ready to give up. He was the one who found Carol's Cherokee rose. He was the one who carried her out of the tombs, and out of Terminus, and out of every dark place she'd ever been. Without Daryl, Carol doesn't have a tether, and a Carol without a tether is a Carol who might disappear entirely. Into the woods, into herself, into a silence that never breaks. But Glenn lives. Glenn, who has just watched his friend beaten to death in his place, carries a guilt that will shape the rest of his life. He knows, even if no one says it out loud, that Daryl threw that punch because Abraham was dead, and Negan killed Daryl because of the punch. The chain of causation is clear and terrible. Glenn lives because Daryl died, and Glenn will spend years trying to make that trade worth something. Glenn and Maggie at Hilltop, raising their son Herschel, and Glenn becomes the co-leader that Maggie never quite had in our timeline. His engineering background, his resourcefulness, his willingness to take risks that others won't. Glenn alive means Hilltop is stronger. The alliance against Negan forms more quickly because Glenn is there to run the dangerous missions, to be the one who slips through enemy lines and comes back with intelligence. The Savior War plays out differently, with Glenn alive and Daryl gone. There's no dramatic rescue of Daryl from the sanctuary because Daryl isn't there. Instead, the war is waged by committees and coalitions. Rick and Glenn work together like they did in the early days. Back when Glenn pulled Rick out of that tank in Atlanta, back when it was just the 2 of them navigating a dead city. That partnership, the original partnership of the show, becomes the engine of the resistance. Without Daryl, the question of who becomes Rick's right hand is answered not by another man, but by a woman who's been earning that role since the day she walked out of the woods, with a katana and 2 jawless walkers on chains. Michonne steps fully into the role she was always meant to fill. Not just Rick's partner, but his equal in strategy and combat. The war against Negan becomes a war led by Rick and Michonne, with Glenn and Maggie holding the hilltop, and Carol, if she can be reached at all, operating from the shadows. When Negan finally falls, when Rick slashes his throat under that tree and decides whether to let him die or save him, the decision is different without Daryl's ghost hovering over it. In our timeline, Daryl survived and was present at the final battle. His suffering at the sanctuary, his torture with Easy Street playing on a loop, all of it fed into the group's determination to win. Without that, the war's emotional weight shifts. The face they see when they close their eyes isn't Daryl being broken in a dark cell. It's Daryl being killed in a moonlit clearing, and that anger might be harder to set aside. The long-term effects spiral outward. No Daryl means no journey to France, no waking up on a beach in Marseille, no Laurent, no Isabelle, no trek across a walker-infested Europe, no discovery of his grandfather's grave at a World War II cemetery near Omaha Beach, no crossing through the Channel to England. The entire European storyline of the Walking Dead universe ceases to exist. The French connection to the virus, the hint that French scientists were somehow involved in creating or worsening the outbreak, remains unexplored. The union of hope, the boy some believe could be a new messiah, all of it fades. And Carol. What happens to Carol without Daryl? In the series finale, the last thing they did together was say, "I love you." Not as lovers, but as the two people in this entire dying world who understood each other most completely. If Daryl dies at the lineup, Carol never hears those words. She never says them. And the woman who spent a lifetime being told she was nothing, who finally found someone who made her feel like everything, goes back to being nothing. Or she finds a different kind of strength. One forged not in love, but in its absence. Daryl Dixon spent his whole life being underestimated. His father was an abusive drunk. His brother was a racist bully. Nobody expected anything from him except trouble. And then the world ended, and the man nobody counted on became the man everybody counted on. In this timeline, his death at Negan's hands proves what the group always knew, but never said clearly enough. Daryl Dixon was irreplaceable, and the hole he left is shaped exactly like hope. Let's step forward now to a boy in the woods, a stranger who needed help, and the moment that didn't have to be the end. What if Carl Grimes never died? Of all the deaths in The Walking Dead, Carl's is the one that changed the most. Not because Carl was the strongest fighter or the most strategic mind, but because Carl was Rick's reason. The entire journey, from the hospital in King County, to the prison, to Alexandria, to the war with the Saviors, all of it was about building a world where Carl could grow up. Every time Rick was asked why he kept going, the answer was always the same. My son. Carl was bitten by a walker during the war with the Saviors in the 8th season. He'd gone into the woods to help a man named Sadiq, a stranger who was killing walkers to honor his dead mother's belief that freeing the souls of the dead was a holy act. Carl helped him, and in the fight that followed, a walker bit Carl on the side of his torso. He didn't tell anyone right away. He went home to Alexandria, wrote letters to Rick, to Negan, to Michonne, to the people he loved. He played with his baby sister Judith. He said his goodbyes in his own way, on his own terms. And then, in the sewers beneath Alexandria, while Negan's forces bombarded the town above, Carl showed his father the bite. Yet Rick's world ended in that sewer. Everything he'd fought for, every compromise he'd made, every person he'd killed, all of it was supposed to protect this boy. And the boy was going to die anyway. Not from a war or a bullet or an enemy's bat, but from a random walker in the woods. Carl died in an abandoned church, surrounded by the people who loved him. He shot himself to prevent reanimation. He was 15 years old, but what if the walker missed? What if Carl's reflexes, honed by years of surviving in this world, moved him half a second faster? Or what if Sadiq killed it before it could bite? The scenario doesn't require a miracle, just the smallest shift in timing. Carl lives, and the ripple effects touch everything. Start with the letters. In our timeline, Carl wrote letters before he died, and those letters became the moral compass for the rest of the war. His letter to Rick begged his father to find peace, to end the cycle of violence, to build something instead of destroying something. His letter to Negan acknowledged that Negan's brutality had a logic to it, but argued that there was a better way. Those letters, written by a dying boy, changed the course of the war. If Carl lives, the letters are never written, because they don't need to be. Carl is alive to speak those words himself. And a living son standing next to you saying, "Dad, we can be better than this," carries a weight that even the most beautiful letter can't match. Rick still confronts Negan under that tree. He still slashes Negan's throat, and the decision, save him or let him die, is still the fulcrum on which the future pivots. In our timeline, but Rick saved Negan because of Carl's dying wish. It has to be something after, Carl wrote. Rick honoured that wish at the cost of Maggie's fury and his own desire for vengeance. With Carl alive, Rick makes the same choice, almost certainly, because Carl is right there, watching, waiting to see what kind of man his father really is. And Rick cannot look his son in the eye and choose violence when mercy is on the table. He saves Negan, and this time, when Maggie rages against the decision, Carl is there to face her. Not Rick alone, bearing the weight of a dead boy's wish, but Carl himself, alive and earnest and asking the woman who lost her husband to give peace a chance. Follow the timeline further. Rick's departure at the bridge. In our timeline, Rick blew up the bridge to divert a massive walker herd away from the communities. He was injured, impaled on rebar, barely conscious. He saw hallucinations of Shane, of Herschel, of Sasha. He pulled the trigger on dynamite and seemingly sacrificed himself, only to be rescued by Anne and a CRM helicopter. But with Carl alive, does Rick make the same sacrifice? A man who has already lost so much, who nearly lost everything when Carl was bitten, would he throw himself at that herd? Or would the knowledge that his son is alive, that Carl is waiting for him to come home, give Rick the motivation to find another way? Maybe Rick doesn't blow the bridge. Maybe he finds a different solution. Maybe Daryl or Michonne reaches him in time. If Rick stays, the entire CRM storyline unravels. No helicopter, no 6 years of captivity, no prosthetic hand, no ones who live. Rick stays in Alexandria, raises Judith, and eventually RJ, and grows old beside Michonne. Carl grows up. He becomes the leader Rick always wanted him to be, not through war and trauma and loss, but through the patient accumulation of wisdom that comes from watching your father choose mercy again and again, even when it costs him everything. At the Commonwealth, Carl would have challenged Pamela Milton's class system with the same moral clarity he brought to the war with Negan. He would have been Judith's protector and RJ's big brother, and the living proof that you can survive this world without losing your soul. Negan and Carl would have continued their strange, complicated relationship. In our timeline, Negan and Carl had a mutual respect that defied the hatred between their groups. Carl once walked into the sanctuary alone, shot 2 saviors, and demanded to see Negan. And Negan, instead of killing him, gave him a tour. There was something between them, a recognition of fearlessness in each other. With Carl alive, that relationship deepens during Negan's imprisonment in Alexandria. Carl visits, they talk, Carl holds Negan accountable, and Negan slowly, over years, becomes something closer to the man he might have been before the world broke him. Rick once told Carl that this world was going to be his someday. In our timeline, Carl never got to claim it. In this one, he does. And the world he builds looks a lot like the one his father dreamed about in his best moments. A world where the prison isn't a fortress, it's a home. Where Alexandria isn't a hiding place, it's a beginning. Where the children of the apocalypse grow up knowing that someone fought for them, bled for them, and chose mercy over revenge so that they could have a future worth living for. Carl Grimes, the boy in the sheriff's hat. In this timeline, he doesn't die in a church basement. He lives, and the world is better for it. Take a breath here. We've been through a lot tonight. Let's keep going, gently, to a tree with blood-stained roots, and a choice that defined everything that came after. What if Rick killed Negan instead of sparing him? There's a tree on a hillside, stained glass hanging from its branches, and 2 men fighting beneath it. One is Rick Grimes, bleeding from a gunshot wound, out of ammunition, running on nothing but adrenaline and years of accumulated fury. The other is Negan, leather jacket, Lucille, that grin that never quite reaches his eyes. The Savior's guns have just exploded in their hands, out-sabotaged by Eugene Porter's tampered ammunition. The battle is over. The war is won. All that remains is the question that every war eventually asks. What do you do with the man who started it? Rick asked Negan for 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds to describe the future Carl envisioned. And Negan, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of exhaustion, said yes. In those 10 seconds, Rick reached up with a shard of glass and slashed Negan's throat. Negan fell. Blood poured through his fingers as he clutched his neck, and Rick stood over him, watching, deciding. This was the moment, the fulcrum. Everything that came after, the community's rebuilding, Negan in a jail cell, the Whisperer War, the Commonwealth, Negan walking into Manhattan with Maggie, all of it hinged on what Rick did in the next 3 seconds. In our timeline, Rick said, "Save him." He ordered Siddiq to patch Negan's throat. Maggie screamed. Michonne held her back. Rick declared that Negan's rule was over, that the communities would unite, and that Negan would rot in a cell for the rest of his natural life. "My mercy prevails over my wrath," Rick whispered to himself under that tree, quoting Carl's letter, crying. But what if mercy didn't prevail? What if Rick watched the blood and let it flow? What if the rage of losing Glenn and Abraham and Carl and everything else was simply too heavy, and the glass shard in his hand was the only answer that made sense? Negan dies under the tree. The first thing that happens is Maggie gets what she wanted. Justice, she'd call it. Vengeance, others might say. She watches Negan bleed out and feels something she hasn't felt in years. Not happiness, not relief. Something more complicated. A door closing on a room she's been trapped in since the night Glenn's skull was crushed by a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. The Saviors surrender. Without Negan, they're just people. Scared, exhausted people who followed a strong man because the alternative was weakness, and weakness meant death. They lay down their weapons and walk home. Some of them become productive members of the new communities. Others disappear into the wilderness. The transition is messier than in our timeline, because without a living Negan to point to and say, "See, we chose mercy," the message of peace is harder to sell. Some saviors fight on. Outposts hold out for weeks before being overwhelmed. But the real cost comes later. Negan alive in a jail cell became something nobody expected. He became a mirror. Visitors came to him. Bars sat on the other side of the bars and in the quiet of that small room, forced themselves to confront what they'd done and what had been done to them. Judith Grimes, Rick's daughter, visited Negan regularly. She brought him books, she asked him questions, and Negan slowly, over years of confinement, began to change. Not into a good man, exactly, but into something closer to human than the monster who walked out of that RV swinging a bat. Without that process, without Negan in the cell, Judith never has those conversations. She never develops the nuanced understanding of good and evil that made her such a remarkable young woman. She grows up simpler, more black and white in her thinking. The man who killed Glenn was a monster. Monsters get killed. End of story. And then the Whisperers come. Alpha. The woman who wore walker skin masks and led a herd of thousands posed a threat unlike anything the communities had faced. She drew borders, killed people who crossed them, and displayed their heads on pikes. In our timeline, it was Negan who killed Alpha. He'd been released from his cell by Carol, who made a secret deal with him. Negan infiltrated the Whisperers, earned Alpha's trust, and slit her throat in the woods. Without Negan, Alpha lives longer. The Whisperer War drags on. More people die. The communities scramble to find another way to defeat an enemy who hides inside herds of the dead. Maybe Daryl gets it done eventually. Maybe Carol finds another asset. But the war is bloodier and longer, and the scars it leaves are deeper, and further still. Without Negan alive, there's no journey to Manhattan. The spin-off series, Dead City, only exists because Negan was alive and free. Maggie needed him to rescue her son Herschel, who'd been kidnapped by the Croat, a former Saviour lieutenant who was obsessed with Negan. If Negan is dead, the Croat has no reason to take Herschel. The entire Manhattan storyline, the tribal communities, the Barazi, the methane wars, none of it happens the way it did. Manhattan stays dark, the bridges stay destroyed, and whatever future was waiting in that ruined city remains hidden. Rick carries the weight of this differently. In our timeline, sparing Negan was the hardest thing he ever did, and it was also the thing that defined his legacy. The man who chose mercy when every fibre of his being wanted vengeance. The man who honoured his dead son's wish, even though it felt like a betrayal of every other person he'd lost. In this timeline, Rick kills Negan, and it feels right for exactly one day. Then the doubt creeps in. Carl asked him not to do this. Carl's last wish, written in a letter stained with fever sweat, was for his father to be better, to find another way, and Rick chose the old way, the Shane way, the way of the knife and the gun and the blood on the ground. That doubt follows Rick everywhere. It's there when he looks at Michonne. It's there when he holds Judith. It's there at the bridge, when he stands over the dynamite and wonders if the world he's built is worth saving. Maybe in this timeline, Rick's sacrifice at the bridge isn't about diverting a herd. Maybe it's about something darker, a man who failed his son's final test, looking for a way to make it right. Carl once wrote that there had to be something after. In this timeline, the after comes. Communities rebuild, gardens grow, children are born. But underneath the new world, like a crack in the foundation, there's a question that nobody can answer. Was it worth it? Was killing Negan the right call? And Rick Grimes, wherever he is, carries that question like a stone in his pocket for the rest of his life. Now let's go back, all the way back, to the very beginning, to a building underground and a clock counting down to 0. What if the group stayed at the CDC? This is the scenario that almost happened. In the first season finale, Rick's group found the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and were welcomed inside by Dr. Edwin Jenner, the facility's last surviving scientist. Jenner gave them hot showers, wine, food, and a night of peace that none of them had experienced since the world ended. It was the first time Glenn got drunk. The first time Carl tasted wine and hated it. The first time in weeks that anyone laughed. But Jenner was hiding something. The CDC was running on emergency generators, and the diesel fuel was almost gone. When the generators died, the building's safety protocols would activate a high-impulse thermobaric weapon designed to incinerate every biological agent stored in the facility. The building would be destroyed. Everyone inside would die. Jenner locked the doors and told them the truth. He told them about the virus, about how his wife, test subject 19, had been the last sample he'd studied before the lab was destroyed in an accidental fire. He told them that France had been the last country to hold out, that the French scientists thought they were close to a solution, but that was months ago and no one had heard from them since. And then he told them what he'd whispered to Rick on their way out, the secret that would haunt the group for seasons to come. Everyone is already infected. The virus is in everyone's blood. When you die, no matter how you die, you come back. And then he gave them a choice. Stay and die painlessly, instantly, in a flash of heat so intense you wouldn't even feel it. Or go back out there, into a world that was already over, and fight for a few more weeks or months of suffering. Some of them wanted to stay. Jackie sat down and said she was done. Andrea, grieving her sister Amy, chose to stay as well. Dale refused to leave without Andrea, and his stubbornness eventually convinced her to go. Rick argued with Jenner, pleaded with him, told him that they deserved the chance to try. And Jenner, moved by something, opened the doors. Carol produced a grenade Rick had found in the very first episode, and she'd kept while washing his uniform. She used it to blow out the CDC's reinforced window. They ran. The building exploded behind them. They drove away into the Georgia dawn with nothing but each other and the road ahead. But what if Rick couldn't find the words? What if Jenner broken by months of solitude and the death of his wife, and the annihilation of everything he'd worked for, simply shook his head and said no. Or what if Carol never found the grenade? Or what if the doors stayed sealed just long enough for the clock to reach 0? The building erupts. The thermobaric weapon ignites the air. It's instantaneous. No pain, no fear. Just light and then nothing. And the world goes on without them. Herschel's farm sits undisturbed for months. The walkers in the barn are fed by Otis until the food runs out. Eventually, a herd comes through. The fences fail. The barn opens. Herschel, Maggie, Beth, Patricia, Jimmy, all of them are overrun or scattered. Without Glenn to love Maggie into becoming a leader, without Rick to show Herschel that the dead are truly dead, the Greens die on their own land. The prison remains unclaimed. Nobody sees its potential. Nobody clears it cell block by cell block, plants crops in the yard, builds a functioning society behind its walls. It sits in the Georgia heat, empty and overgrown, until the walkers claim it as just another structure in an endless landscape of ruins. The governor rises and falls on his own timeline. Without the prison group to fixate on, his madness takes a different form. Woodbury might last longer, or it might eat itself faster. Either way, the outcome is the same. Philip Blake is a man who needs an enemy, and if Rick's group isn't available, he'll find someone else to destroy. Negan builds the sanctuary. The saviors spread across the southeastern United States like a virus of their own. Without Alexandria, without Hilltop, without the kingdom, there are no communities strong enough to resist. The tribute system becomes permanent. The New World Order that Negan promised in that clearing becomes the only order anyone knows. And the CRM, the Civic Republic military, with its helicopters and its secrets, and its plan to ensure human survival at any cost, operates completely unopposed. They destroy Omaha. They plan to destroy Portland. They march across the continent, eliminating any community that grows large enough to threaten their supremacy. And no one stops them because the one man who could have done it, the man who would have been taken by a helicopter on a riverbank years later and forced into their ranks, and who would have found a way to burn it all down from the inside. That man died in the basement of the CDC on a warm night in Atlanta when the lights went out. Jenner was wrong about almost everything, but he was right about one thing. He told Rick, "The day will come when you won't be grateful." And he was right. Rick spent the rest of his life being ungrateful for the chance Jenner gave him. Not because the world wasn't worth fighting for, but because fighting for it hurts so much that some nights, in the dark, with the dead pressing against the walls, Rick wondered if the warm light of the CDC wouldn't have been the kinder ending. But he chose to fight. They all did. Carol with her grenade, Dale with his stubbornness, Andrea, who almost stayed but in the end chose life. Every one of them walked out of that building and into a future that was harder and crueler and more beautiful than anything Jenner could have imagined. That's the thing about choosing to live. It's never the easy choice. It's the choice that costs you everything and gives you everything and leaves you standing in the wreckage, wondering if you'd do it again. And the answer, for Rick Grimes, was always yes. Always yes. We're nearly at the end now. One more road to walk, one more choice to make. And this one is about a man on a motorcycle, a gate, and the question of whether home is a place you go back to or a place you build wherever you are. What if Daryl Dixon never left the Commonwealth? Picture the gate, the big iron gate at the edge of the Commonwealth, the largest community any of them had ever seen. 50,000 people behind those walls, hospitals, schools, bakeries, a functioning economy, a place where you could walk down the street and hear children laughing and not feel terror at the sound. Daryl's motorcycle is idling. His bags are packed. Carol is standing beside him, trying not to cry. Judith is there, and RJ, the little boy who'd never met his father, but who called Daryl uncle without any hesitation. Ezekiel is there, quiet and proud. Dog is there, because Dog goes where Daryl goes. In our timeline, Daryl told Carol he was proud of her. Carol had taken over as head of operations at the Commonwealth, essentially replacing Lance Hornsby, and she was making everything better. The community was thriving. Alexandria had been rebuilt. The hilltop was restored under Maggie's leadership. For the first time in years, the world was actually getting better. But Daryl couldn't stay. He'd promised Judith that if he saw or heard anything about Rick and Michonne while he was out there, he'd find them and bring them home. It was a quest, the oldest kind, a man with a motorcycle and a crossbow, and a promise to a girl in a sheriff's hat. So Daryl hugged Carol. They told each other, "I love you." And he rode through the gate and out into the world, which led him eventually to a boat, which led him eventually to the coast of France, which led him to everything that followed. Laurent, or Isabel, the union of hope, Janet and the power of the living, the Channel, England, a grandfather's grave at a World War II cemetery near Omaha Beach, a journey that would span continents and redefine what it meant to search for home. But what if, standing at that gate with the engine running and the road ahead, Daryl looked at Carol and Judith and RJ and Dog, and he thought about something Judith had said. She said he deserved a happy ending too, and maybe, just maybe, he believed her. The motorcycle goes quiet. Daryl kills the engine. He swings his leg back over the seat and stands there for a moment, looking at the road he's not going to take. Carol asks him what's wrong, and Daryl shrugs in that way he does, where the shrug contains an entire autobiography. "Nothing's wrong," he says. Just figured I'd stick around for a while." The first thing that changes is small and immediate. Dog doesn't have to worry about a new routine. That might sound trivial, but in a world where everything changes at the speed of violence, the small constancies matter more than anyone admits. Dog stays in the same house, eats at the same time, sleeps at Daryl's feet, and Daryl sleeps better knowing that his people are on the other side of the wall, not on the other side of an ocean. Carol and Daryl settle into a rhythm that they've never had the chance to develop. For their entire friendship, they've been in motion, running from threats, preparing for wars, mourning the dead. At the Commonwealth, for the first time, they get to be still. They have breakfast together. They argue about nothing. They sit on a porch in the evening and watch the sun go down, and don't say much of anything because they don't need to. This is what peace looks like when you've earned it with blood. It looks boring, it looks domestic, and it is the most extraordinary thing either of them has ever experienced. Daryl becomes the Commonwealth's head of security, or maybe its chief tracker and hunter. His skills, the ones that kept people alive in the wilderness for years, translate into a community role. He teaches young people how to move through the woods without being heard. He leads expeditions beyond the walls to clear walker build-ups before they become herds. He's the first line of defense, and he's very, very good at it. Judith grows up with Uncle Daryl at Sunday dinners. She learns to track from him, to read the wind, to move through brush without snapping a twig. She already has Michonne's katana and Rick's revolver. Now she gets Daryl's patience, and his eye for detail, and his stubborn, inexpressible love for the people he'd die for. RJ gets something even more valuable, a male role model who isn't a ghost or a legend. Rick Grimes is the brave man, a title whispered with reverence by a boy who has never met his father. Daryl Dixon is Uncle Daryl, a title shouted across a playground by a boy who sees him every day. There's a difference between admiring a hero and knowing a person. RJ gets both, eventually, but Daryl's daily presence gives the boy something that stories never could. A hand on his shoulder when he's scared, a quiet, good job when he does something well. The knowledge that you don't have to be legendary to be loved. Now follow the thread that doesn't exist in this timeline. Without Daryl crossing the Atlantic, everything that happened in France unfolds differently. Laurent, the boy born during the apocalypse to a woman who died bringing him into the world, the boy the nuns of an abbey in southern France believe might be a new messiah, has no protector. The plan was always to move Laurent north, to the Union of Hope at Mont Saint-Michel, where he would be raised and nurtured by people who understood his significance. But the escort, a priest named Père Jean, who had mapped the route and made the contacts, died and reanimated before the journey could begin. Isabelle, the nun who served as Laurent's guardian, was supposed to convince Daryl to take over the mission. Without Daryl, Isabelle has to find another way. Maybe she sets out alone with Laurent, following Père Jean's map through the French countryside. It's a journey of hundreds of kilometers through territory controlled by Genet and the Power of the Living, a militaristic faction that has organized large parts of post-apocalyptic France under a brutal philosophy of strength and purity. They would have had to dodge guerrillas, navigate walker-infested cities, and find allies among the scattered survivors who still believe in something better. Maybe they make it. Isabelle is resourceful, and Laurent, despite being a child, has an uncanny ability to connect with people and see into their hearts. But without Daryl's combat skills, without his instinct for survival honed by decades of hardship, the odds are longer. They might arrive at Mont Saint-Michel battered and diminished, with fewer allies and less hope than in our timeline. And the Power of the Living goes unchallenged longer. Genet's experiments with Walker variants, her amped-up chemically enhanced dead, continue without the disruption Daryl caused. The balance of power in France shifts further toward authoritarian control. The Union of Hope, already fragile, might buckle under the pressure. There's a deeper loss too. Daryl's discovery of his grandfather's grave. Private William T. Dixon, buried in a World War II cemetery near Omaha Beach, a man Daryl never knew, who fought and died in France decades before Daryl was born. Finding that grave gave Daryl something he'd been searching for his entire life, without knowing it. A connection to his family that wasn't stained by abuse and failure. A legacy of courage and sacrifice that predated the apocalypse by 70 years. In this timeline, that grave goes unvisited, the flowers stay unplaced, and Daryl never learns that the courage he carries was always in his blood. But here's the other side of the ledger, and it matters. In this timeline, when Rick and Michonne finally make their way home from the Civic Republic, Daryl is there. In The Ones Who Live, Rick and Michonne spent 6 episodes fighting through the CRM's secrets, its conspiracies, its plans to destroy Portland and dominate the continent. They exposed the atrocities of Major General Beale and the entire front line of force. They brought down the military command structure and forced the Civic Republic to reform, to open its gates, to become the force for good it always claimed to be. And then they came home. In the final scene of The Ones Who Live, Rick and Michonne stepped off a helicopter and saw their children running toward them across a field. Judith, who'd known her father for the first 9 years of her life and then lost him for 6. RJ, who'd never met Rick at all. The reunion was everything. Judith told Rick she always knew he was out there. RJ asked if he was the brave man, and Rick said to call him Dad. In our timeline, Daryl wasn't there for that reunion. He was somewhere in France, fighting his own battles, keeping his own promises. But in this timeline, Daryl is standing at the Commonwealth Gate when the helicopter lands. He watches his brother come home. And Rick, stepping off that helicopter, sees the one face he never expected but always hoped for. They don't say much, they never have. Rick and Daryl's friendship was never built on words. It was built on trust, all on showing up, on being the person the other one could count on when everything fell apart. A handshake, a hug, maybe a joke about the motorcycle. And then Daryl takes Rick home to see his kids, and they walk together through the community that survived because both of them refused to give up on it. The family is together, all of them. Rick, Michonne, Carl would be here if our earlier what-if had come true, but even without him, there's Judith, RJ, Daryl, Carol, Maggie, the people who fought and bled and lost and kept going. They're all within the same walls. They eat together, they argue together, they grieve together because there's plenty to grieve, and they celebrate together because they've earned it. Daryl never finds out about Laurent. He never discovers the French connection to the virus. He never meets Isabel or Fallot or Stefan Codron. He never crosses the Channel. He never sees England. But he sees RJ take his first steps without training wheels. He sees Judith graduate from whatever school the Commonwealth has built. He sees Carol smile in a way that isn't sad or forced or covering something. He sees Rick come home. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the happy ending that Judith said he deserved. There's something to be said for staying in a franchise built on movement, on running from one crisis to the next, on the road as both escape and destiny. There's something radical about a man who puts down roots. Daryl Dixon was the eternal wanderer. Even before the apocalypse, he was a drifter, following Merle from place to place, never belonging anywhere, never staying long enough to matter. The apocalypse didn't change that pattern. It amplified it. Every time Daryl found a home, something destroyed it. The quarry camp, the farm, the prison, Alexandria. Every time he built a bond with someone, the world tried to sever it. Merle, Beth, Denise, Rick when the bridge blew. The lesson the world kept teaching him was the same lesson his father taught him, with fists and silence. Don't get comfortable. Don't trust the good times. Don't believe you deserve anything better than what you've got. In this timeline, Daryl breaks the pattern. He stays. He trusts the Commonwealth's walls to hold. He trusts Carol to be there in the morning. He trusts that the good times might last, not forever, because nothing lasts forever in this world, but long enough to matter. Daryl Dixon spent decades surviving. In this timeline, he finally learns to live, and the sound of it isn't an engine revving or a crossbow firing or boots on asphalt. It's a screen door closing gently behind him as he walks out onto a porch where the people he loves are sitting in the last light of a September evening, doing absolutely nothing and being absolutely content. And if that isn't a happy ending, then maybe happy endings don't exist. But I think they do. I think they're quieter than we expect. I think they look like two people on a porch who don't need to say anything, because everything that matters has already been said. We've walked 10 roads tonight that no one ever walked before. 10 doors that opened into worlds that almost existed. Worlds that were one decision, one moment, one heartbeat away from becoming real. We started with Rick Grimes lying in a hospital bed, Orvie, the man who almost never woke up. We stood in a moonlit field where Shane almost won. We found a little girl in the woods who almost came home alive. We kept a white bearded man with one leg alive, long enough to change the world. We watched Carol not reach terminus in time and felt the weight of what that absence means. We let a different person fall to Negan's bat and traced the devastation through decades. We gave a boy in a sheriff's hat the chance to grow up. We watched a father fail his son's final test. We stayed at the CDC when the clock hit 0. And we kept a man on a motorcycle from riding into the unknown. None of these timelines are better or worse than what actually happened. That's not really the point. The point is that every moment mattered, every choice had weight, every person. I went from Rick Grimes in his hospital bed to Sophia Pelletier in the Georgia woods, shaped the world by being in it. The Walking Dead was never really about the dead. It was about the living, about the choices we make when everything is taken from us, and the only thing left is the question of who we want to be. Rick answered that question by choosing mercy when rage would have been easier. Carol answered it by walking into fire for the people she loved. Daryl answered it by refusing to give up on anyone, ever, including himself. Glenn answered it by running toward danger instead of away from it. Maggie answered it by building something when everything she had was destroyed. And tonight, in these 10 quiet what-ifs, we got to see the shadows of those answers. The roads not taken, the lives not lived, the worlds that almost were. They're all still out there, those alternate timelines, hovering at the edges of the story, like ghosts in a Georgia forest. You can almost see them if you close your eyes. Almost hear the crunch of gravel under Rick's boots on a road he never walked. Almost feel the warmth of a porch where Daryl and Carol sit in silence while the sun goes down. Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable. I hope the world outside your window is quiet. I hope that wherever you drift off to tonight, you carry something from these stories with you. Not fear, not sadness. Just the simple, stubborn knowledge that in a world full of endings, there is always another way, another choice, another road. Sleep well. The dead may walk, but the living endure. And if you remember nothing else from tonight, remember this: you made it through another day. And in this world, in any world, that is enough. That is always enough. We're the ones who live. And there's more to consider about a world without Rick Grimes. Because Rick wasn't just a leader, he was an architect. The man had a vision for what survival could look like, and that vision went beyond finding food and building walls. Think about the quarry camp outside Atlanta in those earliest days. A handful of tents, a fire pit, a few scared people, arguing about whether to go into the city or stay hidden. Shane was keeping them alive, sure. He organised watch rotations. He made sure the camp was defensible. But Shane's vision ended at the perimeter. Keep the walkers out. Keep the people in. Don't think too far ahead, because thinking ahead means acknowledging that this might be forever. Porque Rick walked into that camp and immediately started thinking bigger. Not just today and tomorrow, but next month and next year. Where do we go when this falls apart? What kind of place do we need to build? Who do we need to become? Those questions, so simple and so enormous, were the foundation of everything that followed. The farm, the prison, Alexandria, the Commonwealth. Every step forward was Rick asking, what comes next? While everyone else was still stuck on, how do we survive today? Without Rick, nobody asks those questions. Or if they do, they ask them too late, after the cost of not asking has already been paid. The world becomes a patchwork of tiny camps and frightened groups, none of them connected, none of them growing, all of them slowly shrinking as the dead claim more ground, and the living claim less. The infrastructure of civilization, the roads and bridges and power plants and water treatment facilities, deteriorates faster because nobody organizes repair crews or salvage missions. Medicine runs out because nobody establishes trade routes between communities that have different supplies. And here's a detail that gets overlooked: the relationships Rick built. Not just friendships, strategic alliances. Rick's ability to walk into a hostile situation, Herschel's farm, the prison, Woodbury's refugees, Alexandria, the hilltop, the kingdom, and convince people who had every reason to distrust him that their survival depended on cooperation. That ability was unique. It wasn't charisma in the traditional sense. Rick wasn't charming. He was earnest. He looked people in the eye and told them the truth, even when the truth was terrible. And something about the way he carried himself made people believe that he would fight for them as hard as he fought for his own. Take that away, and the communities that eventually formed the coalition, the alliance that defeated the Saviors and later the Whisperers, and eventually reformed the Commonwealth, never come together. Ezekiel stays in his kingdom playing king to a dwindling court. Hilltop goes through a series of leaders, none of them with Maggie's fire or Gregory's connections. The Oceansiders stay hidden. The Scavengers play their games in the junkyard until someone stronger comes along. And Alexandria remains what it was before Rick arrived, a gated neighborhood full of people who don't know how to change a tire, let alone fight a war. The arithmetic of Rick's absence compounds over years. Every life he saved was a life that went on to save other lives. Every community he built became a refuge for people who had nowhere else to go. Every enemy he defeated was an enemy who would have destroyed something irreplaceable if left unchecked. Take Rick out of the equation, and the losses don't just add up, they multiply. There's a concept in ecology called a keystone species. Remove one species from an ecosystem, and the whole thing collapses, not because that species was the biggest or the strongest, but because it held the web together. Rick Grimes was a keystone species, and a world without him isn't just a world with one fewer person, it's a world where the web itself comes apart. That's the weight of What If. One man in one hospital bed, and the entire future of human civilization hangs in the balance. Let's talk a little more about what happens after Shane takes over, because the details of Shane's leadership reveal something important about the difference between surviving and living. Shane Walsh was, in many ways, the most qualified person in that quarry camp to lead a survival group. He was a trained law enforcement officer. He was physically imposing. He was decisive. He could assess threats and respond to them faster than anyone else in the group. If you were building a team to survive the first week of the apocalypse, Shane would be your first pick. But the apocalypse didn't last a week. It lasted forever. And the skills that make someone good at surviving the first week, aggression, suspicion, the willingness to sacrifice others for the greater good, are the same skills that make someone terrible at building something that lasts. Under Shane's leadership, the group would have functioned like a military unit. Chain of command, operational security, strict discipline. New people would be vetted aggressively, and anyone who didn't contribute would be cut loose. There would be no room for vulnerability, no tolerance for weakness, no space for the messy, complicated work of being human. Dale wouldn't have lasted long. The old man with his RV and his binoculars and his insistence on doing the right thing, Shane would have seen him as dead weight. A moral voice is a luxury in Shane's world. You can't eat principles, you can't build walls with ethics. Dale would have been sidelined, ignored, and eventually would have left or died without anyone noticing or caring. Glenn wouldn't have become what he became. Under Rick, Glenn evolved from a resourceful pizza delivery guy into a strategic thinker, a moral compass, and eventually a symbol of what the group was fighting for. Under Shane, Glenn would have been useful. Sure, good at supply runs, quick on his feet. But Shane wouldn't have invested in Glenn's growth the way Rick did. Glenn would have stayed a soldier, not a leader, not a symbol, just a soldier. And Michonne, the woman with the katana who became Rick's partner, his equal, the love of his life, and eventually the co-architect of the CRM's downfall. Without Rick, Michonne is still out there somewhere. She might still arrive at the prison gates, or whatever stronghold Shane's group has claimed. But Shane wouldn't have earned her trust the way Rick did. Michonne chose Rick because she saw in him something she recognized, a person who had lost everything and kept fighting not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Shane's fight was different. Shane fought because he was good at it. Michonne would have seen through that in seconds. The tragic irony is that Shane loved Rick's family. He genuinely loved Laurie and Carl. His worst instincts came from a place of desperate, possessive love, not from cruelty. In a different world, in a world where the dead stayed dead and the living stayed predictable, Shane Walsh might have been a decent man. A flawed one, certainly. A jealous one, but decent. The apocalypse didn't make Shane worse. It removed the structures that kept his worst impulses in check. Without laws, without society, without the expectation that someone was watching and judging, Shane became what he'd always had the potential to become. And in a timeline where Rick never wakes up to provide the counterbalance, that potential unfolds without resistance. Carl is the person who suffers most in this scenario, and it's worth lingering on that because Carl's evolution is the moral backbone of the entire series. In our timeline, Carl Grimes went from a scared kid hiding behind his mother to a young man who could stare down Negan without flinching. He learned courage from Rick, compassion from Herschel, resilience from Michonne, and stubbornness from Daryl. He had models for every kind of strength. Under Shane, Carl learns one kind of strength, the kind that comes from a closed fist. Shane would teach Carl to shoot, to fight, to suspect everyone, and trust no one. Carl would become competent and dangerous and hollow. The boy who, in our timeline, died trying to help a stranger. The boy who wrote letters about mercy and peace. That boy never develops under Shane's mentorship. Instead, Carl becomes a younger version of Shane himself. Quick to violence, slow to trust, incapable of imagining a world where the answer isn't always a bullet. And Laurie. Laurie Grimes, who is so often dismissed by fans of the show, is actually the most trapped person in this scenario. She knows the truth about Shane, or at least suspects it. She knows that the man who's leading them, the man who's raising her children, is not the man she would have chosen. But she's pregnant, she's alone, and the world has reduced her options to zero. Laurie becomes a ghost in her own life, smiling when she's supposed to smile, sleeping next to a man she doesn't trust, carrying a child whose father she can't be sure of. It's a quiet horror, the kind that doesn't make for dramatic television, but that destroys people just as surely as any walker bite. There's a version of this timeline where Laurie breaks, where the accumulated weight of pretending becomes too much, and she tells Carl the truth, or confronts Shane, or simply walks into the woods and doesn't come back. And there's a version where she endures, where she channels all of that pain into protecting her children, and bides her time, and waits for something better. In either case, her life is a testament to the specific cruelty of this what-if. The man she needed came back from the dead, and in this timeline, he never did. Now let's expand on something about Sophia that we touched on earlier, but didn't fully explore. Because the what-if of Sophia being found alive isn't just about Carol's transformation, it's about what Sophia herself would have become. In the show, Sophia was defined by her absence. She was the girl in the barn, the walker who stumbled into the daylight wearing a rainbow shirt. She was a symbol of failure, of the group's inability to protect its most vulnerable member. Every time Carol did something extraordinary in the years that followed, from taking Terminus to killing Alpha's spies at Alexandria, it was rooted in Sophia's death. Carol became extraordinary because she lost the thing she loved most. But what if Sophia had lived? Not just survived, but lived, grown up in the apocalypse alongside Carl, alongside Judith, alongside all the other children who inherited this broken world. Sophia would have been shaped by two formative experiences. First, her father's abuse. Ed Pelletier beat Carol and terrorized his daughter. Sophia grew up afraid of loud men and sudden movements. She knew how to be small, how to disappear into the background, how to read the mood of a room and adjust herself accordingly. These are survival skills of a different kind, the kind that children of abuse develop out of necessity. And in a world full of predators, both living and dead, those skills would have been devastatingly effective. Second, her time alone in the woods. Even if Daryl found her within days rather than weeks, Sophia would have spent time alone in the Georgia wilderness, hunted by walkers, surviving on instinct and luck. That experience would have marked her permanently, not broken her, but hardened her. She would have emerged from those woods with a knowledge that most children are spared, the knowledge that the world is not safe and never will be, and that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. Combine those two experiences, and you get a young woman who is simultaneously hyper-vigilant and deeply empathetic. Someone who notices everything, who reads people with uncanny accuracy, who can sense danger before it arrives. Someone who, like her mother, would do absolutely anything to protect the people she loves, but who, unlike Carol in our timeline, hasn't been stripped of her compassion by unimaginable loss. At the prison, teenage Sophia would have been Carl's peer and counterpart. Where Carl inherited Rick's leadership instincts and Shane's capacity for violence, Sophia would have inherited Carol's adaptability and Daryl's loyalty. The two of them, growing up side by side in a world of constant danger, would have developed a partnership that combined Carl's boldness with Sophia's caution, his willingness to act with her ability to plan. At Alexandria, Sophia would have seen through the community's facade faster than anyone. She grew up reading people for survival. The Alexandrians' comfortable obliviousness would have set off every alarm in her head. She would have been the first to identify the cracks in the walls, the first to notice that the community's leaders were playing house while the world outside waited with its teeth. And when Negan came, when the lineup happened, Sophia's presence would have changed the emotional mathematics of the group's response. One more person to protect, one more person to fight for, one more person who looked at the dead and the monsters and said, "I'm still here." There's a scene I can imagine that didn't happen but almost feels like it did. Sophia, 17 years old, standing on the walls of Alexandria with a rifle, watching the horizon. Carol comes up beside her. They don't speak for a while, because they don't need to. They've spent their whole lives communicating without words, the way people do when words have historically meant danger. Finally, Carol says something like, "You should go inside, get some rest." And Sophia says something like, "You first." And Carol smiles, really smiles, in a way that she hasn't smiled since a barn door opened on a Georgia farm and the world ended for the second time. That smile. That's what this What If is really about. Not strategy or survival or the butterfly effects of one decision rippling across decades. It's about a mother and a daughter standing on a wall together, watching the sun go down, alive. Let's linger on Herschel for a moment longer too, because there's a scene in the show that reveals everything about who Herschel was and what his survival would have meant. In the prison, during the flu outbreak, Herschel walked into cell block A knowing that the disease was killing people, and that anyone who died would reanimate. He was an old man with one leg. He had no medical equipment, limited medicine, and a moral philosophy that most of the group considered dangerously naive. Maggie begged him not to go in. Rick offered to go instead. Herschel went anyway. He spent days in that cell block, nursing the sick, putting down the reanimated, holding people's hands while they died. When a young man named Glenn, who would become Herschel's son-in-law and the most important person in Maggie's world, collapsed from the flu, Herschel sat beside him and refused to leave. Someone asked Herschel how he could keep going in there, surrounded by death, knowing that every patient might turn at any moment. And Herschel, in that quiet voice that carried more authority than any shout, said a version of something he believed to his core. You can be afraid and still do the right thing. You can look at the darkness and still walk toward the light. Not because you're brave, but because someone has to. That's what the group loses when Herschel dies at the prison gates. Not just a doctor, not just an advisor, not just a kindly old man with a white beard. They lose the person who believed in them even when they didn't believe in themselves. The person who told Rick again and again, in different words and different situations, that the man he was becoming in the apocalypse wasn't the man he had to be. That mercy wasn't weakness. That hope wasn't foolishness. That the most important thing you could do in a dying world was refuse to let the world make you cruel. With Herschel alive through Alexandria and the Saviour War and the Whisperers and the Commonwealth, the moral fibre of the group is stronger. Not because Herschel fights harder or thinks smarter, but because he reminds them, saw in every quiet conversation and every gentle admonishment and every time he walks into a room and simply refuses to be afraid, that they are fighting for something worth having. A world, a real world, where children grow up and fall in love and argue about stupid things and build houses and plant gardens and die of old age in their beds. That's what Herschel sees when he closes his eyes. That's what he fights for, with every breath in his one-legged body. And with him alive, the people around him fight for it too. There's something else about Terminus that deserves exploration, something that makes the what-if of Carol's absence even more devastating than it first appears. Because Terminus wasn't just a slaughterhouse, it was a mirror. Gareth and his people didn't start as cannibals, they started as idealists. The signs they painted on the railroad tracks were sincere at first. Sanctuary for all. Community for all. Those who arrive survive. They meant it. They opened their gates and welcomed strangers and believed that cooperation was the answer to the apocalypse. And then other survivors came, not the desperate and the grateful, but the violent and the predatory. And they took Terminus by force. They raped. They tortured. They locked Gareth and his mother and his brother in the same train cars that would later hold Rick's group, and they taught them through weeks of brutality that the world had only two kinds of people, the butchers and the cattle. Gareth chose to be a butcher. That origin story matters because it shows how thin the line is between Rick's group and Gareth's. Both started with the same impulse, to build something, like to protect people, to create a pocket of civilization in the wilderness. The difference was that Rick had people around him who pulled him back when he went too far. Shane pushed him toward darkness, but Herschel pulled him toward light. Carol's pragmatism was balanced by Glenn's idealism. Daryl's violence was tempered by his loyalty. Rick walked the line because his people held the rope. Gareth had no rope. When his idealism was beaten out of him, literally, in those train cars, there was no Herschel to whisper about mercy, no Glenn to insist on doing the right thing, no Carol to demonstrate that you could be both ruthless and loving. Gareth fell, and he fell hard, and he became the thing that had destroyed him. If Carol doesn't save the group at Terminus, Rick's people join the long list of survivors who walked toward a painted sign and never walked out again. But there's an even darker possibility. What if some of them survived the initial slaughter? What if Gareth, recognizing Rick's usefulness, or Carl's youth, or Michonne's obvious strength, kept a few of them alive? Not out of mercy, but out of pragmatism. Gareth had a system. He didn't just kill people, he evaluated them. The strong ones might be useful. The weak ones were food. In a scenario where Carol doesn't arrive and the initial chaos of the trough is followed by a more calculated assessment, some of Rick's people might have been separated from the others and given a choice. Join us or feed us. And that's the real horror of Terminus without Carol. Not just death, but transformation. The possibility that Rick Grimes, yet stripped of his people and his hope and faced with the choice of dying in a slaughterhouse or becoming a butcher himself, might have broken in a way that even the governor and Negan couldn't accomplish. The possibility that the leader who chose mercy at every turning point might, in his darkest hour, choose survival at any cost. It wouldn't have happened. Rick would have died first, but the question alone is enough to make you grateful for Carol and her rifle and her propane tank and her stubborn, ferocious, impossible love. Let's breathe here for a moment. Let the tension drain. Listen to whatever sounds surround you right now. The hum of a fan, the whisper of wind, the distant murmur of a world that's still turning. These stories are heavy, and they should be, but you don't have to carry them. You can set them down whenever you want. That's the beauty of what-ifs. They exist in the space between thought and sleep, and they weigh nothing at all unless you choose to hold them. When you're ready, let's talk more about the weight of Negan's bat and the man who threw the punch that changed everything. There's a detail about Daryl's punch that doesn't get discussed enough. It wasn't calculated, it wasn't strategic, it was pure, unprocessed rage. Daryl had just watched Abraham, a man he respected and fought beside, get beaten to death by a stranger with a grin and a baseball bat. And when Negan shoved Lucille into Rosita's face, forcing her to look at the blood and brains of the man she loved, Daryl snapped. That's who Daryl was. Not a strategist, not a politician, a man who felt things so deeply that when the pressure exceeded his capacity to contain it, he erupted. It's what made him dangerous and unpredictable, and, paradoxically, what made him the most trustworthy person in the group. Because Daryl's reactions were never calculated, they were honest. And in a world where everyone wore masks, literal and figurative, Daryl's inability to pretend was a kind of integrity. But integrity has a price. And on that night, in that clearing, the price was Glenn. In the timeline where Negan turns the bat on Daryl instead, that integrity becomes a sacrifice. Daryl dies because he couldn't watch suffering without responding. He dies because his heart was bigger than his tactical brain. He dies the way he lived, refusing to be a spectator to cruelty. And the people who survive carry that differently than they carried Glenn's death. Glenn's death was a punishment, a lesson in obedience directed at the group through the most innocent among them. Daryl's death in this alternate timeline would be a punishment too, but a more personal one. A direct consequence of one man's refusal to kneel. The symbolism matters. In our timeline, the lesson of the lineup was that Negan punishes the innocent for the crimes of the defiant. Glenn died for Daryl's punch. That injustice fueled the rebellion. The moral outrage of it, that a man who did nothing wrong was murdered because someone else did something right, became the emotional engine of the Savior War. In this alternate timeline, the lesson is different. The defiant one pays his own price. There's a grim fairness to it that makes the moral calculus harder. Negan punished the man who threw the punch. That's not justice exactly, but it's internally consistent with Negan's philosophy, and a Negan who plays by his own rules, however brutal, is harder to rally against than a Negan who arbitrarily destroys the innocent. Rick would know this. Somewhere in the grief fog of the aftermath, Rick would understand that the rebellion is going to be harder to ignite when the victim was also the aggressor. Daryl threw the punch. Daryl paid the price. Some members of the group might even feel, privately and ashamedly, that Daryl brought it on himself. That thought would be corrosive. It would eat at the group from the inside, creating guilt and division where there should be unity. Maggie's role changes entirely in this scenario. In our timeline, Maggie became the face of the rebellion because her loss was the most visible and the most unjust. Glenn was innocent. Glenn was kind. Glenn was the person everyone loved. His death galvanized the communities in a way that almost nothing else could have. With Glenn alive, Maggie is still a leader, still formidable, still the woman who would eventually run the hilltop and face down every threat that followed. But her leadership isn't forged in the same fire. She leads from strength rather than grief. Her authority comes from competence and vision, not from the sympathetic rage of a widow carrying her dead husband's child. It's a different kind of leadership. Not better or worse, different. Glenn, for his part, becomes the person who has to live with the knowledge that he survived because someone else died in his place. This is a burden that would define his character for years. Every morning, Glenn wakes up next to Maggie. Loudly, every time he holds his son Herschel, every time he looks in the mirror, he sees Daryl behind him. Not as a ghost, but as a question. Are you making this worth it? Are you living a life that justifies the trade? Some people crumble under that weight. Glenn doesn't, because Glenn never crumbled under anything. But the weight is there, and it changes the shape of everything he does. He volunteers for the most dangerous missions because some part of him believes he owes a debt that can only be paid in risk. He advocates for mercy because Daryl died from an act of compassion, punching Negan to defend Rosita's dignity. And Glenn refuses to let that compassion be the wrong lesson. He becomes, in many ways, more like Daryl than Daryl ever was. The man who runs toward danger because someone has to. The man who refuses to stand by while someone else suffers. And Carol. If Daryl dies at the lineup, Carol's trajectory is the most difficult to predict because Carol has always been the most unpredictable character in the franchise. She has oscillated between gentleness and savagery, between withdrawal and engagement, between wanting to die and being willing to kill anyone to stay alive. Daryl was the constant in that oscillation. He was the pendulum's anchor point. Without the anchor, the pendulum swings wild. Carol might become the most dangerous person in the apocalypse, hunting saviors with a cold efficiency that makes even Rick uncomfortable. Or she might disappear entirely, walking into the woods the way she walked away from Alexandria, finding a cottage somewhere and closing the door and never opening it again. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Carol would grieve in the way she's always grieved, privately and violently, and with a determination to never feel this kind of pain again. She would channel that determination into action, because Carol has never been able to sit still when people she loves are in danger. But the action would be different, darker, less surgical, and more scorched earth. In our timeline, Carol killed Alpha through deception. She recruited Negan, sent him undercover, and waited patiently for for the result. It was a chess move, elegant and bloodless from Carol's perspective. In a timeline where Daryl is dead, Carol doesn't have the patience for chess. She walks into the Whisperer camp alone, the way she walked into Terminus. And she doesn't stop until Alpha's skin mask is on the ground and the herd is scattering and Carol is standing in the middle of it all, covered in blood, wondering if this is enough, knowing that it never will be. Now let's return to the CDC and the question of what knowledge died when those doors sealed shut. Jenna told the group two things that changed the course of the series. First, that everyone was already infected. The virus was in everyone's blood, and death from any cause would result in reanimation. Second, and less remarked upon, that France was the last country to hold out. The French scientists thought they were close to a solution, and then contact was lost. That second piece of information became, years later, the seed of an entire storyline. In the post-credits scene of The Walking Dead, World Beyond, a French doctor downloaded decade-old transmissions from Jenna about America's response to the outbreak. Inside a French laboratory marked with graffiti reading, "The dead are born here. A man hunted the doctors responsible." He told them, in French, "You started this, all the teams, then you made it worse." The implication was staggering. The French scientists didn't just fail to stop the virus, they might have created it, or at least created the variants, the faster, stronger, more aggressive walkers that would later appear in France and challenge everything Daryl and his allies fought for. If the group dies at the CDC, that information never reaches anyone who can act on it. Jenna's research, his understanding of the virus, his wife's brain scans, all of it is incinerated in the explosion, and the French connection, the possibility that someone, somewhere, understands the origin of the outbreak, remains a loose thread that no one ever pulls. In our timeline, that thread was pulled by Daryl's journey to France, his encounter with Dr. Lafleur's lab at Maison Mère, the power of the living's experiments with Walker variants, the union of Hope's belief that Laurent represented a new beginning, all of it traced back to the same scientific infrastructure that Jenna referenced in his final days at the CDC. Without Rick's group surviving, without Daryl eventually crossing the Atlantic, that infrastructure is left to operate without interference. The experiments continue, the variants evolve, and whatever hope existed for understanding the outbreak, for maybe someday finding a cure or at least a treatment, fades into silence. Jenna's last words to Rick were prophetic. The day will come when you won't be grateful. It became the title of the Season 7 premiere, the episode where Negan killed Abraham and Glenn. Rick wasn't grateful then. He was broken, but he was alive, and being alive meant he could fight back, and fighting back meant that everything Jenna died for, all that knowledge, all that sacrifice, wasn't entirely in vain. In the timeline where the CDC claims everyone, Jenna dies alone. Not with survivors pounding on the glass, not with Carol's grenade blowing out the window. Just alone, in the dark, with the clock at 0 and the air turning to fire. And whatever he knew about the virus, whatever his wife's brain scans might have revealed to a future scientist with better equipment and more resources, goes with him. That's the quiet tragedy of the CDC What-If. Not the deaths, though those are devastating enough, but the knowledge, the understanding, the possibility that somewhere in those computers and those samples and those meticulous notes there was a thread that could have been followed all the way back to the beginning, to the French labs, to the teams who started it, to the answer to the only question that ever really mattered. Why did the dead start walking, and how do we make them stop? In our timeline, the answer is still out there, still waiting in this what-if. It burned with everything else. And then there's the question of what Rick Grimes would have become if he had killed Negan, and whether the man who made that choice could ever have found his way back. Rick's identity. By the time he stood under that tree with blood on his hands and a shard of glass between his fingers, was built on a series of choices that each narrowed the gap between who he was and who he was becoming. Every time he killed, he justified it. Every time he showed mercy, he paid for it. The calculus was brutal and unforgiving, and by the end of the Saviour War, Rick had done things that would have been unthinkable to the man who woke up in that hospital. He bit a man's throat out with his teeth to protect Carl. He slaughtered the hunters at the church with a machete. He led a preemptive massacre of a saviour outpost while the men inside slept. Each act pushed him further from the deputy sheriff, who ate hamburgers in a patrol car and worried about his marriage. Carl's death was supposed to pull him back. The letters, the dying wish, the vision of a peaceful future where old enemies tended gardens together, all of it was meant to remind Rick of who he could be if he chose something other than violence. And at the tree, with Negan bleeding at his feet, Rick made that choice. He chose the version of himself that Carl believed in. Not the Rick who killed, but the Rick who could stop killing. In the timeline where Negan dies, that version of Rick dies too. Not literally, but spiritually. The man who walks away from that tree with blood drying on his hands is someone new. Someone who chose rage over mercy, revenge over redemption, the satisfaction of an ending over the uncertainty of a beginning. And here's what makes it truly tragic. Rick would know. He would know immediately and permanently that he'd made the wrong choice. Not because Negan deserved to live, but because Carl asked him not to do it. The last thing his son ever wanted, written in a letter by a dying boy with a walker bite on his torso, was for his father to be better. And Rick couldn't do it. That knowledge is a poison that has no antidote. You can justify killing. You can rationalize it, contextualize it, tell yourself that the world demanded it and you had no choice. But you can't justify breaking a promise to your dead child. There's no rhetoric for that. There's no comfort in it. There's just the memory of a boy's handwriting, shaky with fever, asking for something his father couldn't give. Rick would carry that for the rest of his life, through Alexandria's rebuilding, through the Whisperer War, through the Commonwealth, through every sunrise and every sunset and every quiet moment when the wind died down and there was nothing to distract him from the sound of his own failure. And maybe that's why, in this timeline, Rick's sacrifice at the bridge feels less like heroism and more like atonement. Not I'm saving my friends, but I'm making up for the thing I can never make up for. The dynamite, the explosion, the helicopter, all of it is Rick running toward the only kind of forgiveness available to a man who broke his promise to his dying son. But here's the thing about Rick Grimes. Even in his worst moment, even at his most broken, he builds. It's compulsive. It's involuntary. You could take everything from Rick, his family, his community, his hope, his self-respect, and he would still somehow start building something in the ruins. A wall, a garden, a plan. He can't help it. It's who he is. So even in this darker timeline, even carrying the weight of Negan's death and Carl's broken promise, Rick builds. The communities recover. The gardens grow. The children are born and raised and taught to read and shoot and hope. The world gets better, slowly, painfully, imperfectly. Not because Rick made the right choice under the tree, but because Rick kept making choices after it. Because that's what the living do. They keep going. Even when they don't deserve to. Even when they can't explain why. They keep going because the alternative is the CDC clock counting down to 0. And somewhere deep in Rick Grimes' chest, in a place that no amount of grief or guilt can reach, there's a voice that says no, not today. Today, we keep going. And so they do. And so we do. And so the world turns, and one what-if at a time, spinning stories that never happened and never will, but that teach us something about the ones that did. Tonight we held 10 different worlds in our hands. 10 fragile, impossible worlds made of choices and consequences, and the spaces between heartbeats where everything hangs in the balance. We set them down gently, one by one, and let them rest. And now it's time for you to rest too. The dead may walk, but the living dream. And in those dreams, every road not taken is still out there, waiting to be walked, waiting to be wondered about, waiting for someone like you to close their eyes and follow it into the dark. Good night, sleep well. Tomorrow the world starts over, and we're the ones who live. And if you're still with me, still floating somewhere between waking and sleep, there's one last thought worth carrying into the dark. Every character in the Walking Dead universe, every person who held a weapon, or held a hand, or held their breath while the dead scratched at the walls, they all believed they were making the right choice. Shane believed it when he pulled the trigger. Carol believed it when she lit the match. Rick believed it when he picked up the glass. Negan believed it when he swung the bat. Even the governor, even Gareth, even the Whisperers in their rotting masks, they all believed that the world they were building, however terrible, was the only one that could survive. The what-ifs don't judge those beliefs. They just show us what happens when the beliefs are tested by different circumstances. A Rick who never wakes up isn't worse than the Rick who did. He's simply absent, and the absence reveals how much his presence mattered. A Shane who leads isn't a villain. He's a man doing his best with the tools he has, which happen to be the wrong tools for the job. A Carol who doesn't reach terminus isn't a failure. She's a woman on a different road, carrying the same love, pointed in a different direction. That's what makes these stories worth telling, even in the quiet hours when the world is sleeping and the only audience is someone drifting off with headphones in. Because the what-ifs remind us that the distance between the world we got and the world we almost got is measured in seconds and inches and the smallest of human choices. A grenade in a pocket, a punch thrown in rage, a boy helping a stranger in the woods. Every one of those moments was a coin flip, and every coin flip landed on a specific side. And that's the story we know. But the other side is there too, spinning forever in the air, never quite landing, never quite fading away. The Walking Dead ran for 11 seasons and spawned 4 spin-off series because it understood something that most stories don't. The apocalypse isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is the people, the choices, the quiet moments between the violence where someone decides who they're going to be. Rick decided at the tree. Carol decided at terminus. Daryl decided at the gate. Glenn decided every single day he was alive. Every morning he woke up and chose to be kind in a world that punished kindness. And you decide too, every day. Not about walkers or saviors or secret military organizations, but about the smaller, quieter things that matter just as much. Who to help, who to forgive, when to fight and when to let go, when to stay and when to ride through the gate on a motorcycle with nothing but a crossbow and a promise. Those choices make the world, yours and mine and everyone's. One decision at a time, one what-if at a time, one breath at a time, so breathe and sleep. And if you dream tonight, dream about the roads not taken. They're beautiful in their way, sad and strange and beautiful. Good night.